A while ago, I watched a reel from Jordan Side about the truth about being bulky, etc. And it was because someone was asking a question about, oh, look at the CrossFitters, why they bulky? You said you can't get bulky, etc., etc. And he had made some really good points, but I wanted to take it a step further. I don't want to say this is a critique of what he said, but I think I want to add a little extra layer to what he was saying. First and foremost, no matter what, even after what he said, if you've watched it, I don't want you to be afraid of being bulky. And he did correctly say that it takes the proper conditions to get what you might consider bulky, but you don't get there by accident. Now, he correctly mentioned nuance, and I think that was the most important thing for him to say, because I think that first we have to understand the definition of bulky, because I think everybody defines that differently. I have listened to clients talk about somebody with any sort of muscle to consider to be called bulky, and some others were looking at somebody who was a bodybuilder and called it bulky, and others even still somebody who had a little bit extra body fat and called that bulky. So I think first and foremost you have to define it, and there is not a universally accepted definition. So for that reason, it's hard to even have any sort of conversation around that term bulky or toned or any other thing really, because there is no set definition. And whenever you want to have a conversation or a debate or a discussion, it is extremely important that you and the person you're speaking to have the same definition for the topic that you're discussing. This is where we get so off the rails and into arguments, because we don't even understand the initial point, which is what is the definition of the thing that we are discussing. So put that aside for now. The word bulky or toned or all these things are very nuanced, are very individual. But I will say that for most people, when they're talking about toned muscle, I would have to say that this is just a point on a spectrum from having no visible muscle to having a lot of visible muscle, let's say on a bodybuilder. There's this spectrum and this gray area, if you want to call it, in between of levels of amount of muscle. So what you consider toned or bulky might be different than the next person. But the truth of the matter is, to get to this whatever your definition of toned would be, or even bulky, you'd have to move towards the direction of having a lot of muscle. And you kind of need to stop where you feel like you need to stop. But again, toned muscle is just a point on this spectrum, and what you define as that point is individual. But I think the appearance of tone depends on a few things, right? It depends on your limb length. Shorter limbs tend to show bulk a little bit more, or show muscle a little bit more. Somebody with a longer limb, their muscle tends to look longer unless they're building a lot of muscle. Then it actually end up looking bigger in the end. That's an aside. The amount of body fat percentage you have definitely defines tone, because the more body fat you have, the less that you might consider it toned, because you won't see the individual contours of the muscle if there's a lot of body fat on that muscle. The amount of muscle on the body affects the appearance of tone. And of course, it can actually be thrown off by your height and your proportion. If your limb lengths are slightly different, it will look differently. So you might look like an upper body tone and a lower body no tone, or vice versa, because of your height and because of your limb lengths and proportions, etc., right? And he properly mentioned in his argument that in order to build muscle, to end up like one of these CrossFit athletes or bodybuilders, you have to be doing things properly. And by doing things properly, you have to be hitting these certain numbers and certain key points and key actions to get there. And this is really underlines my point, where you should not be afraid of being bulky, because you can't get there by accident. The process is the same. Remember, because it's a spectrum, the process of getting towards this tone is the same. But the details define the amount that you have to do and the amount you go through this process, right? So whatever it means for you, And I know there's concern with what we would consider bulky, but I would say, I would still make the argument that it's hard to get bulky. It's very hard. You don't get there by accident. First and foremost, though, the best way to get so-called bulky or put on any sort of size at all, whether it's body fat or muscle, is to be in a calorie surplus. Those people who are trying to build muscle tend to be in a calorie surplus of some kind. You've heard about bulking season, right? They're trying to gain weight. So they have to eat more than they're expending so that their body creates more tissue with the energy that comes in, right? So you can't get there if you're in a calorie deficit. It's impossible to get what you would consider bulky, whatever that definition is for you, without being in a calorie surplus. That's first and foremost. So when somebody's trying to maximize muscle, they are going to be in a calorie surplus. They're going to be trying to get adequate protein. They're trying to maximize their recovery. They're going to have to maximize their training intensity. But I think also a big component of how much muscle you put on and how you look has to do with your genes, your genetic makeup, your height, your proportions, your body's propensity to put on muscle or fat. So some things are not even in your control. But the process is still the same. Whether you want to lose body fat and look toned and maintain muscle, or put on a little bit of muscle, not to the point where you might be afraid of, the process is the same, but the details that define the amount that you need to be doing. You're still going to be focusing on your training intensity. You're still going to try to maximize your recovery, maximize your protein, and get into some sort of either calorie maintenance or calorie surplus. So if you haven't watched the video, go back and look at his video. He made some great points, but I do want to argue that the general consensus I get with the definition of bulky, you cannot get bulky by lifting weights. You get bulky by more than likely the calorie intake, your nutrition side of things, more than putting on muscle. Because putting on muscle itself is hard to do. Your body actually doesn't really want to put on muscle, because a lot of muscle means more energy, and when calories are scarce in the environment, it's a luxury to have muscle.